Going to be looking at Daniel tonight. You know, I've been told my whole life that I would argue with a brick wall about almost anything. I feel like I've gotten better about that. But I will say, if there's one thing that I will argue about and that I know about, it's music. In the 80s, I'm going on record. I won't say it's the worst. No, it is not as objective fact. Who's the expert here?
Not a guy not living in the 80s.
It's not a salvation matter? Okay. Fair point. So you guys should be thankful for that. It wasn't much worse than the 70s, or much better than the 70s, I'll give that. Other than classic rock. Everything else out of the 70s. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. Last week we talked about, or I mentioned the fact that we're going to have to go back in time a little bit, because we did sort of a survey of the captivity, which took us through all 3 deportations. And since we're going to be backing up to Daniel, or beginning a look at Daniel, we'll have to go back in time to the first deportation, because we looked at the fact that Daniel was taken to Babylon in the first deportation of the Babylonian takeover. Daniel and his 3 friends were in the first one. They were of the nobility. This is what we read in Daniel chapter 1, the first few verses, which corresponds to 2 Kings 24. But we're done with Kings and Chronicles at this point. It says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. He took some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So, like we mentioned also last week, the captivity, the exile, was not the punishment for their disobedience. It was an added punishment because they didn't submit to the original punishment. And then it wasn't a total cancellation of Israel. It was a culling. So God was purging the rebels with this Babylonian takeover and preparing the remnant. So this is a major turning point in the history of Israel, but also in the development of God's whole plan. So the theocracy that God formed at Sinai with Moses ends with this point. This period of transition begins, this new form, transition into a new form that was going to be established by the Messiah begins. So even this, we may feel like we're still right in the middle of the Old Testament, but this transition period has already begun. So the restoration after the 70 years of captivity wasn't really a reestablishment of the Old Testament Israel, but it was just sort of after he purged the rebels, now it's kind of starting over to sort of bridge the gap until the days of the Messiah come. And, you know, once Nehemiah finished building the walls of Jerusalem, that was right around the time of Malachi prophesying, and as we've looked at in our Life of Christ study, that was the end of prophecy until John came. So the old Israel, as it was before, never came back, and it never will come back. Their independence was gone, but also their observance of the law of Moses was gone, and it was never completely, fully restored as it had been before. So there was also this element of removing the isolation of the Israelites by language and customs, and reuniting together into one universal family all the scattered tribes of the human race, and opening the way for the revelation of God's divine plan to save all peoples. And to help start that, God raised up Ezekiel and Daniel. They are contemporaries, at least for the most part. Daniel started first, but their ministries, all of Ezekiel's ministry was alongside Daniel's ministry, but Daniel started before Ezekiel and ended after Ezekiel. So, these four characters, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are taken to Babylon. And the purpose of their going to Babylon was to become the king's wise men. They were going to become these infamous wise men that we know about from the Old Testament. They were going to be some of them. So they were going to be put into this training program where they would be taught all the Chaldean things and areas of learning. And they were already very highly capable men. That's why they were taken and chosen for this program. But the first step in this process, taking these foreign people, at least to the Babylonians, they were foreign, bringing them into their land, the first thing they did was what? What was the first thing they were going to do to these people? To these four men? Okay. Well, they would be testing them the whole time. Says it on the screen. Going to give them new names. So, what was the purpose? Well, if we know the meaning of their names, it might help. It sort of answers the question. Daniel means God is my judge. And anytime a Hebrew has El in their name, El just means God. But if a Hebrew has El in their name, which God are they talking about? The God, right? So it's different than having Yahweh in your name, but at the same time, it's not really different when a Hebrew has El in their name because Yahweh is the God that's being referred to. So Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means the grace of Jehovah. Mishael means he that is the strong God. And Azariah means Jehovah is a help. Okay? So then their new names are, Daniel's name is Belteshazzar, which means the keeper of the hidden treasures of Bel. Shadrach is Hananiah's new name. It means the inspiration of the sun. Mishael, his new name is Meshach, which means of the goddess Shak. And Azariah's new name is Abednego, which means servant of the shining fire. So what have the Babylonians accomplished by changing these four names? They took God out. They took the true God out and put false gods in their names. And we may not think that would be very effective, but it could be for a lot of people. But like Carl said, it wasn't effective for these four because they were truly faithful, very honorable, valiant men, young men. So it didn't faze them. And we get to know Daniel through this whole book, but we get to meet his three friends, especially in chapter 3, that really give us a good impression of them. So that was a standard procedure. Change their names. Get rid of their former culture, their former gods, right out of their names even. So that's what they did. And Nebuchadnezzar says himself later on in a chapter further down that he gave Daniel a new name according to the name of his God. That's what he said. His own God, according to the name of Nebuchadnezzar's God, is what he says. He was called Belteshazzar after my own God. So that was his purpose. One of the perks of this program was that they would eat and drink from the king's own table. But Daniel said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to eat and drink off from the king's table. And why was that? According to the text, he did not want to defile himself. By what standard? How could he defile himself? By eating some food.
Well,
Okay.
We talk about be transformed. You can be transformed to be like the king here and that, and
Yeah.
stay away from it.
Yeah, that could definitely be a part of it. And then there was also the law of Moses to consider. And there were dietary restrictions there. So there could be a spiritual and a strictly legal aspect to this. But the thing is, he wouldn't even know at this point exactly what he's going to be served as far as the food was concerned. So he didn't even want to risk. He didn't want to take the risk of violating the law of Moses by eating this food and drink. So he requested, and his 3 friends are a part of this as well. Not just Daniel. Daniel may have been the leader in it, but they are also right there with him with the same resolve. And the chief of the eunuchs there is concerned that they would look visibly different and he would get in trouble. So they devised this test, and it turned out that not only did they not look less nourished than the others, they looked even more nourished than the others. So God was obviously working behind this to help them in their virtuous endeavor, and it worked. So they were allowed to avoid defiling themselves with the king's food from the king's table. And the king would never need to find out about it and potentially get offended because it was worked out with the steward there, and they were provided with what they were comfortable having. But we see God working furthermore. It says God gave them learning and skill and in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. It says the king spoke with them, and among all of them, everybody that was entered into this program, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and therefore they stood before the king. So here they are standing before the king. They made it through this 3-year program or so, and now they are officially king's men, wise men. The only difference between them and the others is they actually were wise in every sense of the term. So when we get to Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, his first dream in the book. Very quickly, we'll just go through this. He had a dream of this image. It had a head of gold. It had silver chest and arms. It had a bronze belly and thighs. It had legs and feet that were made of iron and clay together. And then there was this great stone that appeared and struck the image. And struck it down, you would say. Well, the meaning of this dream that Daniel, who does Nebuchadnezzar call first? Does he call Daniel first? Okay, he calls all the wise men. The soothsayers, the sorcerers, the wise men, the diviners, all these names, they're all the same group of people. And Chaldeans is even one of the words for them, even though they're all Chaldeans. All the Babylonians are Chaldeans, that's the same thing. But they were so known for being these soothsayer type people that Chaldeans was just a synonym for soothsayers. Well, they said, Nebuchadnezzar was no dummy. He didn't just tell them the dream and say, what's it mean? He said, okay, tell me what I dreamed first. That was smart. Tell me what I dreamed. Because if he just told them the dream and said, all right, what's it mean? They could have made up anything. And you know what? That's what they would have done, and that's what they always did. They just made something up. Just like people today that can tell the future or your fortune or commune with the dead or any of that stuff. They just make stuff up. It's totally made up. So it's Nebuchadnezzar smart enough to say, first you tell me what my dream was, and then I'll know I can believe you when you tell me what it means. Well, they said, "O king, nobody can do that. Not a man on earth that can do that." Well, they weren't wrong. But then he was told about this man Daniel. Or Daniel comes up. And he says he could do it. And he prays to God. And he goes to his 3 friends, says, we need to pray to God that He'll help us do this. So they prayed to God, and He answered. And Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar and says, there is a God in heaven. He says, nobody, just like the wise men said, nobody can do what you're asking. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and He'll tell you what it is. So Daniel tells him, and here's what he says. The head of gold is you, Nebuchadnezzar, and by that he means Babylonia. Then he says, the silver chest and arms is a kingdom that's going to rise after you. So kingdom number 2, Medo-Persian Empire. History tells us, and the Scriptures tell us. The belly and thighs of bronze is another kingdom. History tells us it was the Greek Empire. Happened in between the Old and New Testaments. Then the legs and feet of iron and clay is another kingdom. A 4th one that's going to be even more powerful than the others. That's the Roman Empire. And then the stone is a kingdom that God, the God of heaven, is going to raise up that will never be destroyed. That's the church of Christ. Okay? So, I've got this on the screen like this because there's going to be another vision, 2 more visions, or another dream and a vision that also has these same applications, these same meanings. So Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, this is what it is. Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, Greek Empire, Roman Empire. And in the reign of those kings, Daniel says, in the days of those kings, God's going to set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's the church. Very important prophecy right there. Daniel 2:44. In the days of those kings, the 4th kingdom is when God's kingdom is going to be established. Well, the day of Pentecost, AD 30, who was in power on that day? Rome. Perfect harmony with this prophecy. It's not in perfect harmony with the idea that the kingdom will be established when Jesus comes back. Rome has been out of power in the world for, I don't even know, over 1,000 years at the very least. So, it just doesn't work any other, but it does have perfect harmony with the day when the church was established on the day of Pentecost, and therefore that is clearly what is referenced there. So, in chapter 3 is when Daniel's 3 friends get their spotlight, and then we don't really get to see them anymore. But this is one of the most famous incidents in history, and especially in the Bible, because it's just such a powerful event. And we don't even really have to go into a lot of detail. Nebuchadnezzar somehow got this idea that he was going to set up this great image. Well, I wonder where he could have got that idea. May have been from the dream he just had. Well, Daniel had told him that the head of gold was him. Well, he makes this 90 feet tall image that's all of gold, that's obviously supposed to represent him in some way, or his kingdom. And he summons all his officials to come, and they're going to bow down to this thing. When they're instructed, they will bow down to this image. This doesn't seem to be a one-time thing, but something that would happen regularly at some intervals. He says, anybody that does not do it will be immediately thrown into a fiery furnace. So no trial, no prison sentence. You will immediately be taken and thrown into a fiery furnace. That is a very strong deterrent, isn't it? Immediacy. If punishment was immediate today, it'd be a lot less crime, I think. If you steal something and you get your hand cut off, much fewer people will be stealing things. That is a strong deterrent. Well, if you're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace, which means you're going to be killed immediately, that's a strong deterrent from not bowing down to this image. Well, there were 3 men. Daniel doesn't seem to be present. We don't know why, but we know that Daniel, was in the same general class of, he definitely would fit into the description here. All the officials and satraps and all these, it just lists every type of official. Daniel was one of them, but he doesn't seem to be involved in this incident. And that's as far as we can take that. We don't know why, but he wasn't. But Daniel's 3 friends were. And some people that didn't like them very much ended up telling on them, saying, hey, they're not doing what you said to do. They're not bowing down to your image. So Nebuchadnezzar calls them up, says, I heard you're not bowing down to my image. So I'm going to give you one more chance. I'll play the music, and you bow down to the image. And what they said to him is one of the most incredible things you could ever imagine. Especially when we remember who this man is. This is the man who made Zedekiah watch his sons be murdered before they gouged out his eyes. Just remember, that's who this is. That's the kind of merciful and tender-hearted man this is. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego look at this king and say, this is Daniel 3. I had it here, but now I lost it. Daniel 3. Okay, yeah, thank you. 16. The quote started in a weird place, so I couldn't see the marks. All right, Daniel 3:16. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Well, I bet that got him prickly instantly. What do you mean you have no need to answer me? If this be so, that is, if you throw us in there, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. He just taunted and said, who is the God that can deliver you out of my hand? They said, our God is able, and He will deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you've set up. So basically what they've just said is, number one, we don't have any, we are not obligated or compelled to answer you in this matter. Number two, our God, to answer your question, is able to deliver us from you, and He will. But even if He doesn't, we're still not going to do it. So what is there that Nebuchadnezzar could do, or anybody could do to them, to make them bow down to this image? Not a single thing in the world. That is essentially what they're saying. No matter what you do, we will not bow down to this image. And not just because they thought that God would 100% for sure deliver them, because they did have faith that He would, but then they said, even if He doesn't, we're still not going to do it. Nothing will lead us to do that. So Nebuchadnezzar says, you make that furnace 7 times hotter than normal. 7 times is an expression. They didn't have a calculator to determine literally exactly, make sure it's 7 times hotter, not 8 times and not 6 times hotter, but 7 times hotter. It just means essentially as hot as physically possible. Get it as hot as it can possibly go. It was so hot that the men who escorted them up there were killed. How did they die? I don't know. But I do know that it killed them. And that's all I know. Of course, there are all kinds of theories about what killed them. But it doesn't matter how they died. It killed them. That's how hot it was. They put them in there with all their clothes. Didn't take anything off. After all, that'd just be less to get rid of afterwards. And they'll catch on fire quicker if they have all their clothes on. So here they're thrown into this furnace. Nebuchadnezzar's watching in there. Total freak. Wants to watch them. He looks in there and he says, didn't we throw 3 men in there? They said, that is true, O king. 3 bound men. We threw 3 men bound into the fire. They said, true, O king. He said, well, I see 4 men unbound. And the 4th, he says, according to the Hebrew, or the original, is like a son of the gods. He didn't say he's like a son of God with a capital G, and he certainly didn't say the 4th is like the Son of God. That's what some of the older versions say. I think maybe the Old King James and the New King James might have followed the Old King James in that. He said the 4th is like a son of the gods. In other words, he doesn't look like a normal human being. Something is special about him. Now, he probably did look like a man, but he didn't look like a normal man. He said there are 4 men in there. The 4th one is like a son of the gods. So then he yelled in there, he said, come out here. And they came out. And everybody that was there saw some marvelous things in addition to what they already saw. Number 1, the fire didn't have any power over their bodies, so they were still alive and they had no burns. But then even the hair of their heads was not singed. Anybody had their hair singed? Any hair on their body or face ever? It doesn't take much, does it? I mean, you don't have to get too close to a flame, even a small flame, to singe your arm hairs or your eyebrows even, or maybe some hair that's hanging down. Their hair, they were in the fire. Their hair was not singed, and their cloaks weren't harmed. And most amazing of all, they didn't even smell like smoke. You walk through smoke, and you'll smell like smoke. They were in the fire, didn't even smell like smoke. And that affected everybody there. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar declared, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. There's you a picture of who Nebuchadnezzar is. He didn't just say they'll be punished, or they'll be thrown in jail, or even they'll be executed. They'll be torn limb from limb. Not the way you want to go. Their house even will be laid in ruins. This is a very cruel man. But he was affected by this. There is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. He got that part right for sure. So then they got a promotion because of this whole ordeal. And this is why they're big heroes, because they stood up to him and said, there is nothing in the world that will ever make us bow down to this image, because that would be a direct sin against God himself and a sin against the commandments that he gave us. So in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And we'll just skip over that. He has another dream. Daniel, again, interprets it. And the purpose was that to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So Nebuchadnezzar, you have what you have because God gave it to you. It's not because you're so great and powerful. God gave that to you. And you better honor him and show him. And if you don't humble yourself, you're going to be made to dwell with the beast for 7 years and eat grass like an ox. And according to the text, that's what ended up happening. And he learned that lesson. To the end that the living may know. Well, he didn't take it to heart, but then that dream came true until he came to realize that Jehovah rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and he learned that lesson. As I pointed out last week and earlier tonight even, while Daniel is in the royal city of Babylon prophesying to the Babylonians, Ezekiel is in the country of Babylonia, out in the country somewhere, prophesying to his fellow Israelites. And then Jeremiah is still hanging around in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem area, prophesying until he's going to be dragged to Egypt against his will. So we have Daniel in the royal city prophesying to the Gentiles. We have Ezekiel in the country of Babylonia prophesying to the Israelites, the Jews. And then Jeremiah is in Jewish territory, or at least their homeland, prophesying to the Jews. All at the same time for at least a brief period of time. So that should be helpful to sort of piece together at least those three men, those three books. Even though we may have trouble getting all the timing right, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Jeremiah, for at least a brief period of Jeremiah's ministry, all three were prophesying at the same time, just in three different places, to three different groups of people, technically. Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a vision. And this is where the vision, the meanings correspond to Daniel chapter 2. So the interpretation of Daniel chapter 7 is pretty much the same as Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. There are 4 beasts. The first beast is the same as the golden image head. The second beast is the same as the chest and arms of silver. The third, same as the belly, thighs of bronze. And the fourth is the same as the legs and feet of iron and clay. And then the kingdom that was given to one like a son of man is the same as the stone that struck the image. So it's the same exact application and interpretation. Have the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and the church, the kingdom of God, the church of Christ. And if the kingdom given to one like a son of man is the church of Christ, then who do you think the one like a son of man is? Christ, yeah. See, that was a simple one. You overthought it. Well, if one like a son of man is Jesus Christ, then who is the one who gave the kingdom, the Ancient of Days? Who do you think that might be? I think you know. You're saying it. You got it. Who do you think gave? When Jesus said, all authority has been given to me, where did he get that authority? The Father, yeah. So the Ancient of Days, the Father, one like a Son of Man, Jesus Christ. The kingdom given to one like a Son of Man is the Church of Christ. But how about this one? Time, times, and half a time. That's fun, isn't it? Time, times, and half a time. This reminds us of Revelation language, doesn't it? This is the kind of prophetic and apocalyptic type of language. Not really apocalyptic, but there is a significance to the number 3.5 in the Bible because of it's the same significance of the number 7. 3.5 is half of 7. Time, there's 1. Times, there's 3. Time is 1. Times is 2, so that's 3 total. And half a time, it's 3.5. Basically, that number means the entire duration of the Christian age is what is being depicted there. It's not meant to be mathematically calculated out to get an exact time period where we know when the kingdom's going to come. But that's just based on false interpretation of prophecies in general and trying to bring about the time when the kingdom's already here. But the time when the Ancient of Days comes, according to this vision, that is the second coming and judgment day. And then the time when the kingdom is possessed would be eternity, not the kingdom, but it'll be eternity. Then in chapter 8, we have another vision that also corresponds to these same things. The only difference is only 2 of the kingdoms are in view, the Medo-Persians and the Greek. So Daniel has a vision of this ram. And this ram is going around beating people up, basically. That's a very loose paraphrase. He's charging west, north, and south. And everywhere he goes, he's unstoppable. But then, in fact, it says he has 2 horns. and one of the horns is higher than the other one. So they're not perfectly level. One's higher. But then he says, what's the other weird thing about these horns? Daniel 8:3. 2 horns, both were high, but one was higher than the other. And then, anybody got it? The higher one came up last. Well, that sounds funny, doesn't it? So both were really high, but one was higher than the other, but the one that was the highest ended up coming up last. So one was higher than the other at first, but then the other one, the shorter one, went up even higher than the other one was. That's exactly what happened with the Medes and the Persians. When they took over, the Medes were more powerful. But then, as time progressed, the Persians rose up and took over the Medes to the point where it wasn't even known as the Medes and the Persians anymore. It was just the Persians. So this ram is the Medo-Persian Empire. The 2 horns are the Medes and the Persians, and the one that came up last was the Persians. The Medes, the first horn was higher at first, but then the other horn went up higher. That's the Persians. But then this he-goat comes along. And he's charging in from the west without touching the ground. What do you think that means? Well, what would you call something that's moving that's not touching the ground? It's flying. That's the only word I could think of. Well, how do we use that word sometimes? If somebody's flying, you say, boy, he was coming through, he was flying. Going really, really fast. That's what he's doing. Without touching the ground means with blazing speed. So he's coming through from the west, blazing speed. This he-goat has a notable horn, and this goat destroys that ram. The undefeatable ram was defeated by this he-goat. Well, this he-goat is the Greek Empire, and the notable horn is Alexander the Great. The horn was struck down in its prime. Alexander the Great died, I believe, at age 33. Prime. 4 horns took its place. When Alexander died, 4 generals were given the kingdom that Alexander took. I mean, it's just history plays this out. And this is the closest the Bible comes to referencing Alexander the Great. This prophecy is clearly, when you look at the history, it's so close, so accurate, that people have attacked this and said this had to have been written after Alexander the Great took over and died. You know why they say that? Like I just said, it's because it's so accurate with the way the history of Alexander the Great played out in the Greek Empire. But you know what people who say that have done accidentally? They've accidentally admitted that the prophecy is so accurate and true. So it's like kind of one of those, whoops, didn't mean to do that moments. Just like when the Pharisees said, by whose power are you casting out demons? It's like, whoops, we just said he's casting out demons and doing all these wonderful, amazing things. They didn't mean to do that. Well, there's no evidence to support the idea that Daniel was written several hundred years after it is believed to have been written. But in making that charge, they're also declaring that the prophecy is just that accurate. So accurate, they can't even believe it. Instead of just believing it, they don't believe it because it's so accurate. Isn't that ironic? But that is Daniel chapter 8. The chronology of Daniel is kind of messed up. In fact, I got these that we won't even go through that. I guess we'll save the last 2 chapters chronologically for next week. There's a lot more detail in that vision than what I just went through that basic part. I guess what's showing up on the screen there is the more detailed parts of it. Charging west, north, and south. Didn't go east. Medes and the Persians didn't go east either. Guess we did look at most of that. From Greece to Persia, the rough he-goat coming in from the west. It'd be east to us, but it'd be west to Persia. Without touching the ground, notable horn, when he was strong, 4 horns. So yeah, we did look at all that. Other than the last little bit there. The little horn is believed to have been Antiochus or Antiochus Epiphanes in 165 BC. 2,300 evenings and mornings. 2,300 days.
What would have been to the east that would have been too big for them to conquer that? Asia?
Yeah, Asia would have been to the east, but they just, I don't know why they didn't go that way. It's just, I guess most of the civilized world was to the west, so they went west and conquered all that region. And then here come the Greeks and the Macedonians coming in from the west, which they could have gone west, but they went east. So the Persians could have gone more east, but they went west, and the Greeks could have gone more west, but they went east. So that same general area, the Mid-East and the Near and Mid-East, that kept getting taken over throughout the Bible period. $2,300 days is another symbolic number. There's no prophetic meaning by taking, the days means years, so it's talking about 2,300 years, and then we tally up the years, and this is a special year when something's going to happen. It's just a figurative, symbolic number. But literally speaking, 2,300 days is 6.25 years. And there is significance to the number 6 in the Scriptures. So basically, you could say it represents a time period that doesn't reach full duration, not fully ended. Number 7 has significance of full divine punishment. So if 7 is full divine punishment, then 6 doesn't quite reach that. 6.25 even doesn't quite reach that. That's just one theory for what that means. But it is a symbolic number for sure. So all this was happening in Daniel's ministry. Chapter 9 also has a prophecy in there that is also very intricate and detailed, that we won't really get into the details of that either. But next week we'll finish up Daniel, which is basically just looking at chapters 5 and 6. 5 being the chapter where part of this prophecy starts to be fulfilled, especially chapter 2. We see the next kingdom coming in, the Medes and the Persians. That ram comes in chapter 5. And then in chapter 6, Daniel has an experience with the king of the Persians, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a run-in with the king of the Babylonians.